In this clip, we're going to be looking at the causes of the Peloponnesian War, which fits in with modern historian debate number 2. Which city really deserved the blame? Was it Athens' fault, or Sparta, or other Greeks such as Corinth? You'll likely get a modern historian that's debating one way or the other, that it was either Athens was heavily to blame, or it was Spartan idleness. You'll have a modern historian debating one of those sides, and while you'll need to support what the modern historian is saying in relation to using key events and sources, you'll also need to challenge their view. So in this clip, what we're going to do is we're going to look at 6 key areas of the debate surrounding the Peloponnesian War and who is to blame for it starting. We're going to be looking at the Corcyra affair, the Mergarian Decree, the siege of Potterday, the debate at Sparta, as covered by Thucydides, the Allied Congress, and the Spartan Ultimatum that's given to Athens. You need to have a rough idea about each of these key events and how it links to the topic. Before we get started, of course, we are helped by an incredibly useful source of information, that is that of Thucydides. The key thing that really makes Thucydides valuable for this particular part of the course is that he's probably an eyewitness account to the vast majority of these debates and discussions, certainly from an Athenian perspective. And of course, Thucydides is an incredibly hard-working historian, and he tells us that he was either present at these events or he's heard of them from eyewitnesses, and he's checked them with as much thoroughness as possible. So Thucydides is incredibly valuable and incredibly useful to us. And because of his later exile, he's possibly able to get a Spartan and Peloponnesian perspective on events. So the period between the Persian Wars and the Peloponnesian Wars, as according to Thucydides' Penta contra Etia, saw a certain massive increase in tension between Athens and the Peloponnese. And sometimes that's really, really, really strong. Other times it does die down a little bit. But on the whole, you've got a pot that is simmering and starts to boil up, particularly in the 450s, the 440s, and then really starting to go for it in the 430s. So what we've seen so far is that even just after the Persians have been pushed out of Greece in 479, we had tensions over Athens rebuilding its walls, the conduct of Pausanias in Ionia, the gradual expansion of the Athenian navy, the wealth of Athens. We had some disputes between Athens and Sparta to do with the Thassos rebellion and the Athenian hoplites being sent home. And of course, we've got the general creation of the Athenian Empire and its transition from the Delian League into the Athenian Empire, certainly under the leadership of Pericles. And then tensions between Athens and the Peloponnesians have been further stoked through Megara's side swapping, the Sacred Wars, and the Athenian attack on Aegina in 458 and the subsequent Battle of Tanagra. Now, even though we'd had more tensions, we'd also had the so-called Peace of Callias between Athens and Persia. A 30-year peace was agreed in 446 BC, which Thucydides tells us meant that Athens had to give up Megara's harbours. Each side were to keep their current allies. The allies must not join another alliance. Neutrals could side with either side. Neither side was to make an armed attack, and Aegina was to be given her independence. And certainly some of those things had clearly not happened. And in particular, Aegina had not been given her independence at all. The Samos revolt had happened in 440 BC, and we're told in one of these events that at this point, Sparta had actually considered going to war with Athens, so much earlier than the actual Peloponnesian War started. So if we get a modern historian that's arguing that Sparta wanted peace, or that it was just Athens's fault for this war being created, well, we do have various examples of when the Spartans actually considered going to war with Athens far earlier. Samos revolt in 440, in order to aid Thassos in 465, and maybe even in retaliation for the allies trusting Athens rather than Sparta right at the start with Pausanias in 479. So basically, we do have a fair bit of evidence that says that Sparta is actually as eager for war as the Athenians are. So case number one, let's look at the Corcyra affair in 435 BC. And this is really a dispute between allies that Athens gets involved in because Corcyra asked for Athens' support. In a nutshell, and remember, it's not this bit that's really crucial for us, but Corcyra got into a dispute with Epidamnus, and they asked, as they were both sort of colonists of Corinth, they asked Corinth to arbitrate, and Corinth found in favour of Epidamnus, and in a little bit of a hissy fit, Corcyra decided to leave and it wanted to join the Athenian Empire instead and asked Athens for aid. It's this debate that Thucydides provides us that's really quite important, but does also lead to Corinth really hating the Athenians. We'll go to the debate in a second. In response, Athens sent 30 triremes. Corinth also sent ships to Corcyra, and we have a skirmish, a naval battle between the Corinthians and the Athenians. So there is already conflict between the Corinthians and the Athenians. The crucial bit for our module, though, is the debate in Athens from the Corcyran representative and the Corinthian representative. The key thing, again, Thucydides is probably there, or even if he wasn't there in person, he will have known other Athenians that absolutely were in the assembly for this. From the point of view of Corcyra, it was Corinth that was the aggressor, and Corinth was planning to defeat Corcyra and then turn them against Athens, and turning against Athens with Spartan help. And basically the Corcyrans were mainly saying that if the Athenians allowed them to join, they could combine navies and they'd have a much stronger fleet. The Corinthians are, and this is the really important bit, maintain that Athens will be breaking the treaty if they allow Corcyra to join an alliance with them. What's really intriguing about what the Corinthians say is that they maintain that they had stopped Sparta from doing just that early on in the terms of the Samos revolt. So basically what the Corinthians says is that, first of all, don't help Corcyra because it's going to create a war between Corinth and Athens. It's going to set a precedent because then different allies will swap. But the key thing that we need to be aware of is Corinth say that they persuaded the Peloponnesians, the Spartans, not to help Samos when it was in revolt against Athens. So again, that's where we get our information that Sparta may have wanted to go to war much earlier, but because of the way that the Peloponnesian League works, Sparta has to agree on something before going to the Peloponnesian League rather. Corinth blocked Sparta at that Peloponnesian League stage. So the fact that Sparta was even able to take that decision to the Peloponnesian League shows you that Sparta must have voted for war. So that's really, really, really important. There is a very cool inscription in the Acropolis Museum that commemorates the defensive alliance between Corcyra and Athens. But essentially, the Athenians were told by Thucydides didn't want the strong Corcyran navy to pass into Corinth's hands. Corcyra is also a really strategic location in between Greece and Italy. So we can add this Corcyra event to our pot that is starting to bubble up. Our second tension, or immediate tension rather, is the Mergarian Decree issued by Pericles in 432 BC. And basically what the Mergarian Decree does is it bans Megara from the ports in Athens' empire. Interestingly, for such an important cause, there's not much in Thucydides. In fact, there's only two key references in Thucydides to 167 and in book 139. And they basically say the same thing anyway, that the Megarians are excluded from the port in Athens itself. So it's really quite interesting that such an important decree, and later on the Spartans are going to say that war could be avoided if the Mergarian Decree was revoked. It's interesting that there's only such a teeny weeny bit in Thucydides. So we've got to use Aristophanes and Plutarch for an alternative. Now, is it because there's only a little bit in Thucydides? Is that because the Mergarian Decree actually reflects really negatively on Pericles, and on the whole, Thucydides is actually pretty pro-Pericles? So if we look at Aristophanes and Plutarch, well, Plutarch maintains that Mergarian Decree was passed because the Megarians had cultivated sacred land, they'd killed an Athenian envoy, and it was passed to divert the attention from one of Pericles' friends' trial, the trial of Phidias. The much lewder discussion of the Mergarian Decree comes from Aristophanes in Arcanians, and he basically says it's all about Aspasia, which is Pericles' mistress, and a theft of prostitutes that goes on. And basically Pericles is protecting Aspasia's interests rather than that of the state. The important thing with Aristophanes, though, is that whilst he's writing satire, it is crucial that we remember that he is there at the time. He is a contemporary source. And even though it's satire, even though it's comedy, we could say that this is valuable because it gives us a street-level Athenian view that maybe it is Pericles' fault that this Mergarian decree is passed, and maybe that's why Thucydides doesn't give us that much detail on it. So let's add the Mergarian decree onto our pot. Basically, because Megara would be really incensed by this and would be taking this to the Peloponnesian League. Another event that we can add on to this is the siege of Potterday in 432 BC in northern Greece. It's a much more simple, straightforward affair, that of an Athenian ally really wanting to leave Athens' empire when it sees sort of how repressive the Athenians could be. Potterday, importantly, had lots of Corinthian citizens in there as an ex-Corinthian ally, and when the Athenians start besieging Potterday, it's important to be aware that Corinth was fully aware that her citizens were actually in the town itself. So it's easy to see why Corinth, because of the siege of Potterday and because of the debate about Corcyra, would be really wanting to attack Athens and wanting Sparta to do something with these Athenians. Thucydides gives us some really useful further discussion about Potterday, basically giving Potterday preemptive instructions to pull down a wall, send hostages. They basically feared Potterday may revolt, and that Macedon in the north was also urging Athenian allies to rebel. Yet again, Sparta promised aid if Athens attacked Potterday. So again, we've got Sparta sort of starting to get more and more involved in these affairs. Another occasion where Sparta promises aid to a city that's being attacked by the Athenians. So our pot is now looking pretty heavy if we add Potterday onto there. And so that's why Thucydides then gives us the debate at Sparta, where an Athenian trade delegation just happens to be in there in Sparta at the time when the Spartans are debating about whether they should call a meeting of the Peloponnesian League to go to war. And there's 4 speeches in Thucydides' coverage: that of the Corinthian ambassador, an Athenian delegate that's unnamed, the Spartan king Archidamus, and the Spartan ephor Sthenelaidas. The Corinthian is really quite aggressive towards the Athenians and the Spartans. And he basically says that, yes, it's Athenian aggression, but it's also Spartan neglect. The Athenians deprive states of freedom, but it's Sparta, through their slow action and inactivity, that are really responsible for this. And they are really urging the Spartans to do something. And if not, they're going to find allies that will. The Athenians, though, use the age-old Athenian debate that actually they're entitled to do what they do because of their actions during the Persian Wars, where they did the most to save the Greeks. And crucially, they say that the reason why they're in that position is because the Spartans were unwilling to lead the allies, and that the allies begged the Athenians to lead them. And yes, they do think of their own interests, but they only control their allies in the same way as the Spartans control their allies in the Peloponnesian League. And he says an argument that would fit in well with Spartan idea, that the idea is that the weak should give in to the strong. And the Athenian also maintains that the Athenians treat their allies much better than the Persians do, but they're pretty ungrateful. The key thing that the Athenian does, though, is he makes a bit of a threat at the end of his speech. He's really unapologetic, and he says, if you begin the war, we shall meet you in any and every field of action that you may choose. Now, the Spartan king Archidamus is much more cautious, and he fears that Sparta needs to take time to build up its resources. They've never faced an enemy like the Athenians before. But then he's countered by the E4 Sthenelaidas, who essentially says that an attack on Sparta's allies is like an attack on Sparta itself. And he says that they've got a bad record with the Spartans and the Athenians. The Spartans should help our allies who are victims of Athenian aggression, and he urges the Spartans to vote for war, which they do, and that then leads us on to the Allied Congress, which is a meeting of the Peloponnesian League allies. So because Sparta has voted for war, it means that the Peloponnesian League then meet to discuss this issue. And the Allied Congress is really a good example of Thucydides clearly not being at a speech, and wouldn't be there, but because of his exile, is possibly able to speak to delegates and Corinthians and Peloponnesian representatives that actually were at the Allied Congress. Interestingly, though, the strategies that are maintained in the Allied Congress are what happens in the war itself. So is Thucydides writing it with the benefit of hindsight? Obviously he is, but it's still really, really useful and valuable to us. So at the Allied Congress, there's just a Corinthian spokesperson. So you can really see that Corinth is really the one that's most angry at the Athenians. And the Corinthian, and there's only one speech at the Allied Congress, says that those of us that have had dealings with the Athenians know that we need to be on our guard. We don't need to be told that. And he says that all cities should be scared of the Athenians, even if they're inland and they don't live on the coast. It's not going to be long before the danger spreads. And he absolutely says that, yes, I want peace, but in order to protect peace, we need to go to war. He talks about the Athenian allies, about never stopping bringing in contributions to maintain their own slavery. Quite a useful indication of how the Peloponnesians were viewing the allies and their tribute. And he then gives a range of strategies in order to provoke rebellions, to build up the Peloponnesian navy, and to stop the Athenians. And crucially, ironically, refers to the Athenians as a dictator city that's planning to subdue what's not already been subdued. Finally, we've got the Spartan Ultimatum to Athens just before the war. And the Spartan Ultimatum, we're told by Thucydides, is that the Athenians must exile Pericles, end the siege of Potterday, give Aegina back her independence, and end the Mergarian Decree. And crucially, the Athenians refuse. Sparta then returned again. So again, we can say, actually, is Sparta really to blame? Here's another one that sort of says that Sparta is actually, sort of trying to push the Athenians not to go to war. Sparta then returned, told the Athenians they could have peace if they gave the Greeks their freedom, which is a bit ambiguous. The Athenians debated this, and Pericles absolutely said, no, we need to go to war, because if we give in on this point, where's it going to end? And then we're in a war situation. So who is to blame for the war? Is it Athens? Is it Sparta? Is it the other Greeks? Well, if we're looking at Athens, certainly their empire massively expands under Pericles, which threatens Sparta. We've had tensions with Sparta since the Persian Wars, the treatment of Aegina, not giving her independence. Pericles' attitude to Sparta is a massive contrast to Cimon. And then you've got the Mergarian Decree, especially from Aristophanes, and from Plutarch. You've got the Corcyra debate, where Corcyra is admitted into the Athenian Empire, which is going to cause conflict with Corinth. Potterday. The Athenian rhetoric in debates is pretty, the Athenian speaker at the debate at Sparta is very unapologetic and is pretty much saying to Sparta, bring it on. And then you've got the refusal of that ultimatum. What about Sparta? Are they to blame? Well, they kind of are reluctant to get involved in Greek affairs after the Persian Wars. And obviously we've got those tensions since the Persian Wars, such as the Long Wars, Pausanias, and the Thassos Rebellion. It's the Spartans that actually encouraged Samos to revolt from Athens in 440. However, on the other side, the Corinthians say the Spartans don't actually do anything. Do they make too much of the Mergarian Decree? The Spartans later on certainly do say that. In Thucydides 7:18, that's what the Spartans fear, that in relation to the breakdown of the Peace of Nicaea later on, the Spartans are like, actually, earlier on, we make too much of the Mergarian Decree. Crucially, though, it's the Spartans that vote for war, and the declaration of war is made by the Peloponnesian League. In regard to other Greeks, Corinth is clearly the most aggressive city-state towards the Athenians. You can see that at the Corcyra debate, the debate at Sparta, the Allied Congress. Could you blame the Athenian allies for not really resisting Athens? So the Chalcis Decree, one of the exam spec decrees, where you've got an indication of the level of control of the Athenians over their allies. The dispute over Delphi further stoking tensions. Aenea's motion at the debate at Sparta, so it's actually Athena that brings that. Megara's constant side swapping. And even the Corcyraeans, they knew exactly what they were doing by appealing to the Athenians. So the important thing for your exam is to ensure that you've got a thorough knowledge of the various debates as to who is to blame for the Peloponnesian War.